did they really not notice such an outfit? And then said that the rumors that Vanessa Blake was insanely beautiful turned out to be really true, because it was already possible to predict exactly who will be the main character at today's celebration, because this place will definitely be occupied by Duchess Vanessa. In the end, all the girls quickly decided on their outfits, and then the maid said that if they were all done dressing up, they should hurry up and go to the banquet hall. After that, each of them wondered why they had to hurry, because apparently Duke Isaac had probably arrived earlier than expected. At that moment, the main character followed them and wondered if Duke Isaac would be with them from the very first day. She didn't think she would meet him so soon. Then she wondered what kind of man he was. But then at some point her whole body began to shake with fear, and she didn't understand what it was connected with, because it felt like her whole body was paralyzed. At this time, outside the palace, joyful people announced that His Highness Duke Isaka had arrived, and the delighted residents cheered madly at his arrival. And the protagonist literally froze with fear. It was at this time that Her Majesty the Empress was informed that His Highness Duke Isaac had arrived, and so if she wanted to see the young man, she should hurry. And then she put in the last touches in her makeup and looked around herself and fearfully announced that she was ready. But at that moment, her look was insanely frightening, and the atmosphere around seemed very eerie. Eventually, at the next moment, a woman came up to the lad a little in a hurry, and then it was announced that Her Majesty the Empress had arrived, whereupon she called joyfully to the Duke and wished him a happy holiday and told him that the young man was the pride of the whole Alberich Empire, for he had been away for a long time, and they were all worried that something might have happened to him, and she was especially worried. After which she reported with a smile that the man, on the contrary, looked very solid and manly. At this time, one of the knights only grudgingly reflected that their emperor had been tormented by illness for 5 years, and the Empress had already taken an interest in the Duke. Then, looking him over carefully, he reflected that if the attempt on the Duke's life had been successful then, there was no chance that the Empress would be interested in him now. But the next moment, seeing his frightening look of red eyes, he immediately shook with fear, because madly such a thing was not expected. Then stated that this man was quite frightening, and it was as if he read his mind. But at that moment, the man looked at the crown prince with a smile, instead of answering the Empress, and said that it had been a long time since they had seen each other. But as he saw, the boy did not miss his uncle at all, and he just excitedly, shaking with fear, said that it wasn't like that at all, and he was happy to see his uncle, and he just thanked him. Then coming close and touching his shoulder, he said he missed him terribly and hoped the boy knew how much he treasured his nephew and how much he relied on him, for he was his dearest member of the family. Finally, seeing the fear of the last prince, the devil began to absorb his emotion, namely fear, and calmly inquired if the celebration had already begun. Eventually, by this point, the music was already playing and the visiting girls were dancing around with the local knights in a slow dance. And at this time, the protagonist was standing quietly and talking along with Serafina, and the latter was only excited looking at her friend, wondered if everything was definitely okay with Vanessa, for she looked like she wasn't feeling well. But the protagonist, smiling awkwardly, reported that everything was really fine and she needn't have worried, though she still wondered why I was so paralyzed at that moment. Then she stated that even though everything was fine now, she was still uneasy about what had happened, because her main goal today was to meet the Duke and see if he was the right devil or not. But as the girl reached for dessert to distract herself from thinking, she was approached by another lady who told Vanessa that she had heard a lot of rumors about her and was glad to finally meet her. The protagonist was just thinking that she had enough of this girl. At this point, the approaching looking at Vanessa wondered if she didn't know her. She was the daughter of Duke Logan, and she was the most beautiful girl in their empire until her title passed to the protagonist. After the protagonist became the most beautiful girl in the empire, she began to receive countless invitations to parties from the Logan family. And so Vanessa Blake assumed that they were not inviting her with the best intentions, and so she said she was sick and always refused. Vanessa Blake looked at the girl in front of her and said that she knew her well. She was the daughter of the Duke of Logan, and wondered if the girl had anything to say to her. But she calmly said that she had not planned to make any specific conversation, and that it was just surprising to her that the girl felt perfectly well here, though constantly sick in the kingdom of Victoria. But the protagonist calmly said that she had recently recovered, so she didn't understand why this girl was now interested in something like that. But she looked at the protagonist and wondered what the protagonist was so unhappy about. It was written all over her face, She had to try a little harder if she wanted to maintain her status as Duke of Blake. And then looking at Vanessa, she wondered if she got so arrogant because she wanted to find a fiancé here. And Vanessa Blake only wondered what this girl was trying to achieve by such a circus and this behavior, because her nagging did not bother the main character at all. For in past lives, she had constantly encountered such things in the days when she was a countess. And the girl had to be the center of attention at her husband's festivities, and she didn't know how she could stand all the slanted glances and jeers in her direction. Then she stated that if she had verbally fought with all the envious people, she would have had to break her voice. And she knew perfectly well that there was nothing good in such a fight, but realized that it would be a good idea to teach this girl a lesson. At this time, she smiled slyly and looking at Vanessa told her not to worry. For now in this place where they would be chosen, no one would choose her. But at this point, the protagonist stopped her and grudgingly informed her that everything this girl had said before and after the phrase that they would be chosen sounded very bad. And if she wasn't chosen by the knight, she would go and choose him herself. For however much this girl might try to hurry, marriage between lovers is for life. And she did not think that caution in such a matter was to be mocked. Then the protagonist, turning around, realized that she literally felt with her whole body that in their direction began to look, and so thanked the lady for her concern and asked her not to disturb her anymore and not to be interested in her identity. Then reminded her that she had previously said such words as untalented and unremarkable knights, and informed her that this girl should not have assumed that all knights in the empire did not know their language, and she only indignantly tried to yell at Vanessa. But she calmly stopped her and told her that it would be better for the lady if she ended it, and would not continue this kindergarten because she looked very humiliating. Then she looked at her seriously and said that if she ever found out that this girl had spoken badly about her or her family behind her back again, she wouldn't let it go. And when the aristocrats saw such a sinister aura around the protagonist, they immediately started to look at each other awkwardly and then immediately left, realizing that it's not worth it. And at that moment, Seraphima approached Vanessa and said that the girl is really crazy cool. But at that moment, His Highness the Duke entered the room, and then the protagonist excitedly stood for a while without even daring to turn towards him. But when she turned around, she immediately noticed the young man and literally could not believe that he was the Duke. Then she stated that as soon as she saw the young man, she knew he was definitely the devil because she could see it in his eyes. One of those secrets was that the greater the power, the more structurally individual it is, and power can be manifested not only in physical and magical skills, but also in appearance. When powers reach a high level, they allow to learn about the abilities of another person, and therefore, the more capable and strong a person, the more he attracts the attention of other people. At this time, the excited girls watching this Duke Isaac and literally were surprised, for they did not believe that they would be able to see the commander-in-chief of the Celestial Knights in person, and they thought that he would come at the very last moment. But the disgruntled Eric who was watching them only wondered why they were standing there looking at him instead of bowing their heads. At this point, His Highness's aides reported that their Duke Isaac would not be here for long, so they should not have focused their attention on him. This event is dedicated to the memory and gratitude of those who served in the war, and they hope that everyone will have a good rest and find brides. But at that moment, the Duke's attention was attracted by the main heroine, and then he smilingly looked at her and said that this girl has incredible power. She wondered if Duke Isaki could really sense her power. Then there was a possibility that he might be the devil, so she had to get even closer to make sure. But she noticed that there were guards on either side of the young man who were weaker, so they weren't likely to do anything to her. And farther back was a man who looked strong, but like the previous two would still be weaker than her. And it turns out no one would get in her way. But in the next moment, as soon as she made a step towards the Duke, then to her neck was immediately pointed a weapon, and the knights accused the protagonist of rudeness and told her not to dare to approach and quickly moved away. But at that moment, the amazed Isaac, who looked into the eyes of the main character, immediately saw the resemblance to that little girl and literally could not believe that he could meet her. And at that moment, see his stunned look, Vanessa Blake immediately realized that he also recognized her. So she bowed to His Highness and asked if she could ask him to dance. But he just laughed for a while, not understanding what was going on. After which he admitted with a smile that it was really incredible and very interesting turn of events, and he even liked it, and gladly agreed to the dance. After that, he reached out and pulled her closer to him. Then with a smile looking at her face, he asked her what she was going to do next. And the girl said with a smile that now she was going to pretend to fall in love with the young man at first sight. Eventually, during the dance, Vanessa found them dancing to the rhythm of the beautiful music. The Lady of the Fallen Kingdom, and Duke Isaac of the victorious empire. And it was insanely ironic. But there was something that no one here knew about it. Namely that they were hiding a huge secret. At which point the Duke stated that Vanessa was a very good dancer. And was it because she had learned it in one of her past lives? But she calmly and coldly looking at the young man stated that he also moved quite skillfully. And inquired did all devils really dance so well? But he only smiled and pulled the girl closer to him. And said that he didn't know the exact answer, but he was more than sure that not all devils were that good. Vanessa Blake lay thinking about how long she had been waiting for this moment, and if she missed it, she would definitely never see this man again. So she needed to get his favor anyway. And then Vanessa Blake said she knew the gentleman was always hungry, and she knew she was special to him, and then came close to his face and told him that together they could be great partners, and she would be a toy that could brighten his dull days, so he wouldn't regret it. Then she thought that in one of her lives she had been the emperor's mistress. So she knew how to gain favor and please the nobles, and so flawless appearance and luxurious dress were a small part of what could attract them. But she knew she had to take it to the next level to win her favor. But at that moment, the sight of her shaking her face in spite of her impertinent phrases, the man approached and said that she was still as bold as when she was a child, and absolutely nothing had changed, and told the girl to come back here in 2 days. And then he passed by and walked away from the hall. And then as shaking Vanessa realized she only had 3 days and she had to do anything to get this man to agree with her. And then stated that, as she suspected, Duke Isaac was in fact the devil. And he wasn't just any devil. He was her devil. In the end, in the next moment, as soon as everyone had already calmed down, Seraphima came to the protagonist and excitedly took her by the hand and asked what the girl was up to. After all, Duke Isaac had ceased their state, and had the girl forgotten about it. But she calmly asked how it was possible to forget about such a thing, and then Seraphima said that moreover, if they could not marry, this man could deprive their families of their titles, and there were rumors that the man was the devil, and Vanessa was just dancing with him. So now no private knight would be able to get near her. But Vanessa Blake calmly reported that everything was really fine, and asked the girl why she was so worried about her. And she only asked indignantly, how could anyone not worry in a situation like this? But after Vanessa Blake saw her frightened face, she smiled and told the girl that she really didn't have to worry because His Highness was interested in her. And so she thought that, on the contrary, his interest in her would increase. After which she wondered if she thought the knights would be uncomfortable and not want to get close to her, and added with a smile that even in such a case, she herself would make the first step towards them, and therefore believed that there were no knights here so self-confident who would have the courage to refuse her. And then Seraphima shook and said that it was not what she meant, and the protagonist only realized that she knew that it was not what the princess wanted to say. She was talking about Duke Isaac being an enemy of their homeland. Then the maddeningly uncertain girl reported that Duke Isaac had killed many people, killed all the knights and all the servants who lived and defended their kingdom, and even killed their princess and prince. Then turned away and said that of course Vanessa Blake had the right to do what she thought was right, because she was always right. But at that moment, the protagonist calmly looked her over and said that the princess should have realized that they were literally being held here as prisoners. But if at least one girl in the middle had strength and power, attitudes would change dramatically. After which she told the girl that she didn't know if she could become such a protector, but at the very least she was willing to try. In the end, alone with herself, Vanessa realized that everything she had said to Seraphima had been a lie and hypocrisy, even though the princess was right. But after the main character thought that now she really wants to get close to this duke, because she has long forgotten what patriotism means, because of being reborn in a new country every time. But then the protagonist noticed a maid who bowed to the knight and the lady next to him. Then Vanessa Blake immediately remembered that it was the same arrogant maid. So suspecting her closer, I wondered if she could come closer. And she only awkwardly wondered if the protagonist had anything to say to her. Then wondered when this girl had managed to learn their language. At this point, Vanessa Blake looked around her, calmly asked if there were any servants here besides this girl. And she bent down and told a mistress that she was being insanely formal with her, and asked the protagonist to address her more informally. But she calmly explained that now the girl was also being polite to her, although she had expressed herself in a similar manner yesterday. but she only shouted excitedly and reported that she did not know that there was someone among them who knew their language. And at this point, Vanessa wondered what difference it made whether someone knew the language or not. After all, wasn't there a rule in the empire that you could be rude to people who didn't know the imperial language? The girl only stammered in embarrassment and said that it was really her mistake, and she was terribly sorry. And Vanessa Blake calmly said that she didn't need to apologize to her. After all, you should apologize to all the girls as well. Although she wasn't sure if they would forgive her. But at that moment, the maid awkwardly noticed that even if she apologized, the other ladies would not even understand a word. The main character already absolutely did not listen to her because she paid attention to the fact that around became too noisy. And then she noticed that an older maid had appeared in front of her, and rising from her seat, she realized that they had the same uniform. And perhaps the maid was the daughter of the head maid. And now I see why she was so rude. But the next moment, a senior maid approached her and excitedly inquired on what occasion the mistress was holding a conversation with her subordinate. And she calmly explained that there had been talk earlier that even though they came from the fallen state, it didn't mean they could be rude to them, and wondered if the empire no longer suspended maids who disregarded the rules. But the woman only looked at her fearfully and asked how the protagonist knew about it, and the girl did not answer, but thought that she knew it from one of her past lives when she was a servant of this empire. And then in all seriousness told the woman that she had a suspicion that His Majesty approved of the rudeness of visiting girls. But the maid only wondered if the protagonist had meant it. But then the woman realized that it was probably the lady who had recently danced with His Highness. So she looked closely at Vanessa and said that it was not so, and that His Highness had ordered that the young lady should be welcomed and cared for. And if so, she wondered whether in such a case the maid had acted in such a way because of her neglect, and if so, she should be punished. At this moment, the woman bowed apologized to the mistress and said that she would definitely scold this maid for her rude treatment, and asked that the girl have mercy and accept her sincere apology. Then she promised that they would provide the best rooms for the visiting girls from the Kingdom of Victoria, increase the number of servants, and that this woman would personally see to it that all these servants treated her properly. And then the protagonist agreed and turned her gaze to the guilty maid and asked her what her name was. Her name was Amy. And then the protagonist looked at her carefully and said that she had already remembered her, and then went on down the corridors. And then the head maid realized that not only had this girl already won the Duke's favor, she was also now publicly in charge of the palace servants. So she was clearly an unusual person. Then she thought that there was still no one to take the place of the Duchess, and perhaps it would be this lady who would take her place. Eventually, after that very day, the Victoria ladies' attitudes changed dramatically, and their rooms were very luxurious. The food was also of a high standard as befitted ladies of their position. And moreover, the girls were provided with new dresses and accessories. Vanessa Blake, reading the book, thought that she had no idea that in such simple words as Your Highness was hidden so much power. But at that moment, other girls ran up to her and asked Vanessa Blake if she wanted to try on outfits, because they had brought a lot of beautiful dresses. But she awkwardly said that she was busy reading, and so she would try on something later. And they only smiled happily, looking into the face of the protagonist, and thanked her for making their lives much more comfortable. But at that moment, she was approached by Princess Seraphima, who said that she shouldn't have said something like that earlier and apologized and ran away. And the protagonist only looked at her kindly and seemed to hold no grudge at all as she realized that this girl was in a completely different position. And she had no memory of 29 lives. And so she really valued her country. And about the same time, the tailor was preparing an image for His Highness, and wondered whether the man was sure of his choice, for his request was very interesting. But Duke Isaac calmly looked at the man and said that he must have misunderstood or misheard his orders, for he had ordered that the suit be made for him exactly as the emperor wears. Then the man stood in front of the mirror while the insanely frightened tailor continued to take his measurements. And then the man began to feed on his fear, and thought that these emotions were really disgusting tastes that annoyed him immensely. Then his gaze sharpened, and he remembered the main character and stated that no one could replace this little girl, and it would be no fun if he could enjoy her just once. And then smilingly thought that such a pleasure from a delicious meal should have been stretched as long as possible. In the end, at the same time, the knights who were away from training were talking about the recent rumors that His Highness had danced with a girl at the celebration. And then another knight, who was madly surprised, asked how it was possible because their lord had never danced with anyone before. But afterwards they suggested that perhaps their master had fallen in love with this girl at first sight, and she had really caught his eye. But after looking at the young man, they admitted that such a thing was hardly possible. Well, the next moment they noticed Erkin, who looked at them unhappily and asked why they were looking at him so attentively. And they only inquired if he had seen the girl who danced with His Highness and how he could describe her. But the man only calmly informed them that knights, instead of thinking of such a disgrace, would be better off practicing with swords. The knights were madly displeased with this answer. And then they began to reflect on the fact that the man had given his first dance to a girl from an invaded country, and it seemed to all of them that this girl was not at all suitable for his status. But afterwards, one of them said that it did not matter at all, because their lord had only had a passing fancy. And the man himself was thinking that perhaps he should have married this girl. And when his knights heard of this, they cried out in horror. Then they began to think that someone should have stopped His Highness, but none of them dared, because they could easily die by his hand for contradicting his wishes. And at this point, His Highness's crony reported that earlier the knights had asked what kind of man the Duke was, but they only said that they knew the story that an artist had drawn the map. And Duke Isaac threw a dart at the map and ordered the artist to erase the country he'd fallen into. That's the kind of man he was, which is why if the knights wanted to live, they had to dutifully agree with His Highness on everything. Then they started arguing about how long before the girl who dared to dance with him would die. And they all bet that the girl would probably die on our wedding night. And others bet their monthly paycheck that this girl would die before the wedding. But at that moment, the disgruntled man ran after them with his sword and told his subordinates that they were just idiots and should have watched what they were talking about, because it was as stupid and inappropriate as possible. But the next moment, the young man noticed the pensive fellow sitting there and asked him what he was doing. And he said that he would like to accompany a man who was stronger than he was, and therefore he hoped that the next duchess would be stronger. And the young man himself just wondered if the guy knew what he was talking about, because often knights were divided into 5 levels. The group of celestial knights were the highest elite, followed by the group of white knights, the most noble knights. After that, the common knights, the mercenary knights, the lone knights, and those who couldn't become knights. And in the past, there was also a group of black knights with a very bad reputation, so they were let go, and currently the strongest of the group is the heavenly knights, and all of them are mentors for the other knights. And this guy was one of the top 5 strongest sky knights. So the boy realized that it was foolish to hope that he could ever serve a duchess who was stronger than he was. After all, that girl had probably never even held a sword. She looks insanely confident, though. But at that moment, the man stood up and said that if the future duchess defeats at least one of these knights, he will recognize that she is strong. Not quite a guy just yelled at him and told him not to do anything stupid and go back to training. At about the same time, another demoness descended to the ground to eat a young man that in horror shook and looked at his defeated comrades that burned in the fire. And she only tasted his fear and said that it was insanely unpalatable, and then returned to the demon castle. And only with a bored look reported that this world was insanely boring. It was Ravia,